The disorganized thoughts weren't a daily occurrence, when the hallucinations were no longer a weekly occurrence, when they were no longer a monthly occurrence. I didn't know who I was. My name is Katie and I live with depressive type schizoaffective disorder, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my recovery from my symptoms of psychosis. For those of you who don't know, a schizoaffective disorder at its most basic level is kind of like a combination of schizophrenia and a mood disorder. So for me, that's depression. So I experience all of the symptoms of schizophrenia as well as all of the symptoms of depression, and they happen both together and separately. And for me, they tend to come in episodes. I primarily have visual hallucinations rather than auditory ones, but I do have auditory hallucinations. I have quite a few tactile hallucinations. Delusions aren't as frequent for me. I also have a lot of what's called negative symptoms, which are things like feeling empty, which can be kind of like depression. I can not talk much. I cannot experience or show emotion much as well. I also experience a lot of disorganized thoughts. I will have thoughts that don't make sense, but seem to make sense to me at the time. I will have thoughts that are chaotic, that derail, that go off in a completely other direction, that disappear altogether sometimes. Though I still do experience these symptoms occasionally, I am for the most part symptom-free. My recovery from psychosis is multifaceted. There's the recovery after each episode where I'm putting my life back together after struggling when I'm having trouble just getting through the day and functioning in everyday life and things like that. But the part of recovery that I wanted to talk to you about was sort of the emotional and identity portion of it, because getting the schizoaffective disorder diagnosis felt like it robbed me of my identity in a way that I did not expect. I didn't realize that at 17, I put so much of my identity on things like the fact that I was skinny no matter what I ate, that I was, really smart, that I could get all the highest grades without ever having to study, things like that, that I was very athletic. And so when I first was diagnosed and the symptoms kicked in, the cognitive issues made school extremely difficult for me. I went from breezing through AP classes and all the highest level classes and things and winning awards to struggling to memorize a formula in my math class. Because of the weight gain from the antipsychotics that I was initially put on, my athletics really suffered, because no matter how much I tried, no matter how many drills I did in track practice, how many days I ran and worked out in the weight room, no matter how well I ate, I struggled immensely to lose weight and get back down to the weight that I was at before. Suddenly I didn't know who I was anymore. I wasn't the smart girl. I wasn't the athletic girl. I had no idea who I was. And it took me a long time to try and get my identity back. And at a certain point, 8, 9, 10 years into my diagnosis, I had another identity crisis, because I had thought that I had figured it out. I had thought that I had found myself. But what I had found was my diagnosis. I defined myself by my diagnosis. And as my symptoms started to improve more, as we found medications and different types of therapies and things like that that really worked for me and that helped me manage my symptoms better, helped me manage my stress, my emotions, my triggers and things like that, my symptoms began to subside more, and I didn't know who I was without them. I've never enjoyed my symptoms. Even though I've had positive hallucinations in some cases, most of them are very, very negative. Most of them are very disturbing. They are upsetting. They are unsettling. They are just not fun. And so I didn't enjoy having symptoms at all. But I had lived with them for so long because my medication had not entirely erased them. It had done quite a good job. Between therapy and medication and just various stress management techniques, I did very well, but I did have symptoms still on a fairly regular basis. So when they started to subside more and more, and the disorganized thoughts weren't a daily occurrence, when the hallucinations were no longer a weekly occurrence, when they were no longer a monthly occurrence, I didn't know who I was. And that really surprised me, because I hadn't realized how much I'd been defining myself as the girl with schizoaffective disorder. I had found purpose through my diagnosis, but I was struggling to separate that and recognize that I could still have found that purpose. I could still be a mental health advocate. I could still be who I was and not necessarily have to experience those symptoms all the time. That my experiences were not negated because I wasn't having them at that moment. And that I wasn't less credible because I had recovered. I went through a really tough period of wanting them but not wanting them, and just a very confusing time of life. Working through this identity crisis took at least 6 months. It was a lot of introspection. It was a lot of writing about it and getting my thoughts out onto the page where I could sort of look at them from a distance and analyze them, reorganize them. It was talking about it a lot in therapy. We spent a lot of time in therapy talking about how it was okay for me to have an identity outside of my diagnosis. Logically, I understood that that was true. And that was one of the most frustrating parts, is that logically I understood that it was perfectly fine to have an identity outside of my diagnosis. If anything, it's beneficial to have an identity outside of my diagnosis. It was a combination of an analytic and an organic process. Some of it was me picking apart, who do I want to be? What qualities do I want to have? How do I want people to see me? But a lot of it was also just learning who I was by observing and experiencing life. And so I was able to reconnect with myself and find an identity outside of my diagnosis. I didn't have to be the girl with schizoaffective disorder. I'm still a mental health advocate and I talk and write about my experiences. I know that I am more than my experiences. I know that I have a life outside of them. The fact that I am doing well does not invalidate any of my past experiences. I wanted to talk about this because I'm sure that I am not the only one who has experienced this. And I want people to understand that this happens and this is a valid experience. Just because someone is having trouble letting go of their symptoms doesn't mean that they want to be ill, that they want to experience these things. It's just hard sometimes to figure out who you are when that was all you knew for, weeks, months, in my case, years. Psychosis was what I knew. It was almost like a safety blanket, except made out of thorns. It was one that I didn't want, but I didn't know what to do without it. I didn't know how to exist without my symptoms, and I was afraid of letting them go. And it was a very difficult process of finding myself and releasing my need for these symptoms, my need for this painful safety blanket. And if you were in this position, whether you were having trouble letting go of psychosis or something else altogether, be it another mental illness or something else completely, please know that you can get there, that you can find who you are and develop a new identity, develop your identity, recognize who you are, no matter what age you are. And you can recover at any point in time too. So if you are someone who is not at that point yet, if you have not recovered yet, if you're still in the middle of symptoms, please know that there is no time clock on recovery. There is never a point where it is too late for you. There is always time for recovery. There is always the possibility of getting better. So I hope that this is helpful for someone, and thanks for watching.